Hey YouTube, what's up? I'm Joel Wanasek with Unstoppable Recording Machine, and today we're going to take a very basic introduction to compression. Now, compression is something that intimidates a lot of people and can take several years to really get your head around as well as really hear. So how can we speed up that curve and really try to simplify this? So it's kind of a daunting task to really go after in one video, but I'm going to go for it here today. So let's think about compression like this. So compression can serve a lot of different purposes in mixing, but first and foremost, it's to control dynamics. So let's open up a compressor, and I like to grab a transient stem, something with a lot of transients. Okay, so I got this snare track here. Let's open up a compressor, and you can do any compressor. And I'm just gonna grab, let's see, what would be, I'm gonna grab Waves R-Comp here because it's a really simple compressor to see visually. And I like the interface. You can see exactly what's going on without it being too complicated. Okay, so there's a lot of different buttons sliders and things to look at here. So let's break this down so this isn't super confusing. And let's zoom in here on our snare track so we can see what a drum looks like. In my opinion, the easiest way to hear compression is to hear it on instruments with transients, because transient instruments are much easier to really get a basic understanding of what compression does, as well as get your brain mentally around what it does. So there's a couple of key factors here in compression. So first off is the ratio, and that's essentially, if you want to think about it in simplistic terms, how much compression you're adding. Okay, so basically, if I was at a 2-to-1 ratio, that means for every 2 decibels of audio that's getting compressed, about 1 is going to come out. So 4-to-1 would be, at 4 decibels would go down to 1, and etc. All the way. This one goes all the way to 50-to-1. So that's pretty nerdy and might be overwhelming, but basically, think about compression like this. So anything over 10-to-1 is going to be really extreme and what would be called usually generally limiting, where you're completely crushing it. And anything lower in like the 2-to-1, 4-to-1 range is going to be more in the compression range. So, where to set the ratio at when you're learning compression, generally, I like to set it pretty extreme. So let's just go to like 30-to-1 to pick an arbitrary number, and then we can back off on the ratio. Now, the other controls that we need to pay attention to are threshold, meaning where, how much signal. So let me hit play here and look at the meter. So you can see the snare is hitting about -3. So if I bring down the threshold to -5, it should start compressing a little bit. You can see it's doing some compression. So let's bring it all the way down. So you can see I'm compressing the hell out of the signal. Okay, so that's threshold. And then there's gain. So makeup gain, as you compress a signal down, since we're taking, let's say, 30 decibels and knocking it down to 1, you can clearly hear that this gets a lot quieter when I bring the threshold to -60. So we got to use some makeup gain here to bring that signal up. So let me turn it off. If I were to leave the gain at unity, meaning 0, it would do this. It gets pretty quiet, right? Okay, so you can see right then and there kind of how a ratio works and a threshold and gain. And that's the easy stuff to understand. Where compression gets tricky is attack and release times. And attack and release times are a bit frustrating to hear and to understand at first because there's so many of them. As you can see, you can have attack, which would be like 0.5 here, all the way up to 500 at milliseconds here, and a release time from 5 all the way to 5,000. So how do you know what to do? I mean, going from the number 5 to 5,000 is pretty intimidating, isn't it? I mean, how would you know if something should be 4,000 or 2,380 or 6 or 52? So you can really get overwhelmed with compression and attack and release. So the way to think about it like this, if you look at a transient here, so let's zoom in on this. If you look at a snare transient, and follow my mouse. As the audio plays, the attack time is how much of this transient is going to pass before the compressor kicks in. So for example, if we have a slower attack time, maybe 30 or 50 milliseconds, it might start compressing right here where my mouse is and take the signal there. So you could slow down the attack time and then bring up the makeup game and make the tail, which is, you can see the transient's really loud, but then the drum kind of gets quiet. You can make the body of the drum louder. Or if you had a really fast attack time, you could take the transient and you could cut it off and make it quieter and reduce it. Usually that's what you'd expect to see out of a hard limiter. And then release time is when the compressor kind of like goes back to its normal state. So that's a good way to think about it in a super non-technical. And I know that's not technically right. There's the technical definition. It would be like half the, what we're not going to go into it. I don't want to confuse you right now, but basically try to think about it like that. So the attack is when the compressor kicks in, and then the release is when it lets go. Okay, so what does that sound like? So the easiest way to hear this is to open up the attack to a slower time. So let's just say like 50 or 100. And we'll start with the fast attack and fast release. So this is what would be called hard limiting. Okay, so let's hear the snare. So the best way to do this always is to crank the ratio really extreme so you can really hear it, dig in really hard on the threshold, and then turn up the makeup game. So before. So what's happening here under the hood? Okay, so our attack time is very quick. And as a result, we are taking the transient and immediately compressing it at 30 to 1. So for every 30 dB going in, 1 is coming out. And we're aggressively knocking down a ton of it. If we back up the threshold, we can make it so we can dig really deep into the signal, or we can go towards the peak. So let's back off a little. So that helps you understand how attack time plays in. So now let's slow down the attack time here. Listen very carefully to the snare, and you're going to start hearing more transient as I slow down the attack time. So compare that to this. So you can hear how that affects the transient of the snare. So it doesn't matter if we're compressing a vocal, a bass, anything like that. Basically, the attack time is going to really, really allow you to set, I'll call it like the aggressiveness of the sound. How much transient, how much impact do you want on your sounds? Do you want to flatten things out and control dynamics really tight? Or do you want to maybe take something and make it more aggressive and in your face, but keep the punch and dynamics, etc. So those are all ways that we could use compression. Okay, so now that we have attack dialed in, usually I would, so there's a process to this. Let's back up a little bit. So when I want to set a compressor, what I'm going to do, what I'm learning here is I'm going to set a really extreme ratio. I'm going to dial in an aggressive threshold like this. I'm going to find an attack time that I like. Okay, so let's find the attack time that we like. 50 sounds pretty good to me. And then we'll find the release time. So a fast release sounds really exciting and the sound's kind of in your face. Listen to it. Now pay attention as we slow down the release time. And what's going to happen is the sound is going to get more stiff and longer and more controlled. So listen to it. It's going to get a little bit less in your face sounding. Have a listen. Hear how it sounds a little bit stiffer, if that makes sense? Let me speed it up. Where that sounds kind of pumpy and in your face. So on a snare drum or any type of transient instrument, you can kind of hear that a slower release is going to give it, some sustain, back it up a little bit, and make it sound stiffer. Whereas a faster release is going to sound a little bit more exciting and in your face. Now, that's based off the attack time here that I've set. Let's hear what happens if I have it. Okay, so in hard limiting mode, so when it's basically just taking everything and smashing it down, it's going to knock down the transient, and listen to it. Let me slow down the release. How that kind of stiffens up the sound and elongates it, and you can really hear the compressor sitting there and holding on to the sound for a long time. So I try to think about release time as like excitement. Faster releases sound a little bit more exciting and in your face and aggressive, and slower releases to me sound more stiff, held out, and put in place. So it's kind of like, I try to think about releases like a control, like how much control do I want? Do I want it to kind of be wild and jumping around, or do I want to pin the sound down so it really doesn't move too much? So those are all considerations that you need to make when you're mixing. So let's take our sound here now, and now that we've heard this on a snare drum, let's go apply this to vocal here. So I've got some vocals. Let's zoom in on it and have a look at what a vocal wave looks like. And it looks like he's got some compression already applied to this. This looks pretty smooth, but you can see there's some transients here, and some singers are very dynamic. This one is not, but you can see, okay, here's a part with a little bit of dynamics. Let's hear what it sounds like. I see you there. So when he cracks on the I, then he gets to the U there, he kind of backs off a little bit on his dynamic. So maybe we want to make that really aggressive, okay? So that would be a good goal. So let's open up our comp again. And again, you can use any stock compressor. I'm just using our comp because it's very easy to see what it's doing. All right, open it up. Let's move this down here on the ratio and dig in on the threshold. And let's go to the fastest attack and fastest release. And you can hear that that's very consistent, but it also brings up the breath. I see you there. So what happens if we slow the attack down? I see you there. I see you there. You know, the transients really pop out. Let me make it even slower. I see you there. So that's what happens when the attack time is too slow. So let's try to find a happy medium. I see you there. I definitely don't like that on vocals, so I tend to go for a faster attack time personally. I see you there. Let's slow down the release. I see you there. I see you there. Now I love how pinned down that sounds. So what I would do now is the final stage of setting the compressor, because I wanted to show you this on a different source, not just a drum. So I would back off the ratio and the threshold now. So maybe we don't want to crush this so hard. So this is like really extreme limiting. Basically, we're turning this into like a square, if you want to picture it visually, where I'm basically just chopping off everything above the threshold and outputting. It'd be basically like if I were to take the wave and just kind of, I'll clip gain it up, see if I can get it loud enough. If I kind of just did this to it, this is what we're doing essentially, is just turning the signal into that. So we're taking up everything and just kind of smashing it down. So that's how you could think about it visually if you're a visual person. Okay, so at this point, say I like that attack and that release time, and that sounds good to me for this vocal, and I want a really controlled vocal that sounds really upfront in your face. The next thing I would do is I would set the ratio and then adjust the threshold. So how hard do we want to compress it, right? Do we want to crush it? Or let's hear what it sounds like if we back off. I see you there. I see you there. So since we're at like a 2-to-1 here, roughly, we are now. Since we're at a 2-to-1, basically you can hear that there's still some dynamics. We're applying some compression, but we're not really crushing it that hard. Now, if we go to 4-to-1,
I'll see you there.
it's starting to sound a lot more compressed. Let's go to 10-to-1.
I'll see you there.
So really what's happening is it allows you to pick how much dynamic you want. And then the last thing I would set would be the threshold. So let's say we want kind of a dynamic vocal. So let's go to 2-to-1, and we're still going to be really aggressive on the threshold.
I'll see you there.
And now let's see how much we want to attack it.
I'll see you there.
So maybe I'm going to set the threshold here, if you follow my mouse, where this part isn't being compressed, but anything above this line kind of is. So
I'll see you there.
you can see the U is kind of about right here at about -15.
I'll see you there.
So I've brought this down here on the more aggressive parts of that, and I've compressed it. Now, say I wanted to smash the crap out of it, I could just do this.
I'll see you there.
And that's how I generally usually mix, because I like things to be really aggressive and modern and in your face. But in the event that you like a lot of dynamics in your mixes, which some genres totally make sense. I do a lot of pop, metal, and rock and stuff like that, which tends to be a little bit more aggressive, and there's less dynamics. So it's really up to you, but that's kind of how you set it. So let's go back to our snare drum here that we were on earlier. And looks like I turned the compressor off. So let me put it back on. And let's see what we can do with this here. So I'm going to go back to our comp. And let's dial in extreme ratio. Smash, we'll just, yeah, I think I had about a 50 attack time I was enjoying earlier. So now I would set the release. And I like it at about 100 on this song for the tempo. It sounds stiffer. It keeps the compression on just enough where the snare kind of sounds punchy and in your face. I like that. So now that I've dialed it in on an extreme ratio, so step one, again, set the ratio extreme, knock down the threshold, adjust your gain. Now what I'm going to do, I got the attack and the release. So now let's back off on the ratio. See what we like, and then we'll adjust the threshold last. That's getting pretty extreme, so I'm going to use a lighter ratio. Let's go like 2.5. Now we're going to set the threshold. That's what it sounds like. So say that was a compression setting that I liked on this song and I thought sounded good for the snare. If I turn it off, now the snare is a little bit more body to it, not as aggressive. So originally you have a more transient snare, and now after I've compressed it, I've essentially, with these attack and release times, I've kind of turned the snare drum into more of like open sound. That's a better comparison. I'm obviously clipping the crap out of this right now. As I increase the ratio, you can hear the snare getting a little harder sounding. Turn it off. So there you have it. There's a pretty basic introduction to compression, the controls. I know that might be a lot to handle for some of you that are kind of starting out and trying to get your head around this. The most important thing to realize is just this. So use this formula, again, when you're dialing in a compressor, and just listen very carefully. And then obviously, you want to take this stuff out of solo when you're doing it, but solo the instrument that you want to try listening to. Think about what you want to do with it. So do I want it to be punchier, snappier? Do I want it to have less transient, meaning softer? Simple things like that. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take the ratio. We're going to set the ratio to an extreme setting. We're going to dial in the threshold really aggressive and get the right makeup gain so you could hear it. Then we're going to adjust the attack time with a very fast release. And it's very, you can just slide it around until it sounds good and just listen very carefully at how it changes the sound. And then once you find an attack time that you like, try experimenting with the release. Once you find a release time that you like, then back off on the ratio or keep it where it is if you like how it sounds, and then finally adjust the threshold and makeup gain to taste. And then your sound is compressed. Now, this is going to take a lot of practice, and I know that's a lot to think about in terms of compression. Hopefully I've explained this well enough for you to understand without getting too technical. I know there's a ton of things that I left out and we could go down the rabbit hole, but that's really, really beyond the scope of this video. So hopefully that helps you out and allows you to get a basic understanding. Again, I'll just say the formula one more time. Crush the ratio, crush the threshold, set the gain, set the attack, set the release, then adjust the ratio and the threshold and gain after that. So that is the formula to really start hearing this stuff and figuring it out what it does. So thank you so much. If you enjoy this video, please click like, leave a comment, and let me know what you're struggling with in compression so I can make more videos. Please subscribe to our channel for more great mixing videos, and I hope you enjoyed the very basics of compression. Thank you.